Greetings, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the 1611 Authorized King James Bible compared to the KJV. So when I say Authorized 1611 King James Bible, I mean the first printing that came off the press in 1611 and was approved by the Translation Committee and by King James. And I have to emphasize the first printing because there were subsequent printings, one in 1613 and several after, that introduced corruptions. So you must have the first printing. How do I know I have the first printing? Because it lines up with the first printing that is held in the British Library in London. It's exactly the same. That's the one I'm using. So unless you've got a 1611 that lines up with the first printing that is held in the British Library, you may not have the real thing. One of the reasons I'm doing this study is because I've received some very misguided and I would say pompous comments from people who use the KJV and claim that they've actually compared the real 1611 to the KJV. And they say there are no doctrinal changes in the KJV. Now, that is simply not true, and I know they haven't carefully compared the two, because if they had, they would know where the problems are. Yet I often hear KJV defenders say that they have made these comparisons. It's simply not possible for them to have made those comparisons, because when Benjamin Blaney, in 1769, revised the 1611, that's what the KJV is. It is not a translation, it is a revision, and that's a fact of history. When Blaney did that, there were a significant number of well-known and respected scholars that commented on the problems. And indeed, Pollard, in the introductory notes to the 1611, mentions this very thing. And there was a controversy, and it was called the He-She Bible controversy. And Blaney had made mistakes in the pronouns. For example, in the book of Ruth, he changed Boaz going to the city to Ruth going to the city. So the pronoun in the 1611 and all the Reformation Bibles read he went to the city. Blaney, with no training in Greek or Hebrew, changed the pronoun to she went to the city. And there was an outcry at the time, because even the people in the pews knew it was Boaz who went to the city. And this is confirmed when you get to chapter 4 in the 1611 Authorized King James Bible, that it is indeed Boaz in the city. And the reason this is important is because Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, and the kinsman redeemer is a type of Jesus Christ. And the city that Boaz went into is Bethlehem. So to complete the picture, the kinsman redeemer had to come out of Bethlehem, and he had to redeem the church. Ruth is a picture of the church. And so Boaz went to the city, which is Bethlehem, redeemed Ruth, which is a picture of the church, and came out of Bethlehem. And so this is an important distinction. Blaney, in chapter 3, makes the mistake of changing the pronoun he went to the city to she went to the city. And so it creates a doctrinal inconsistency. It makes the witnesses of the Scripture confused and disagree with each other. Now, this is typical of the KJV. But let me just reel things back a little bit. To understand the difference, you have to have something of an historical perspective. The 1611 was indeed a translation from the Greek and Hebrew. It was commissioned by King James, and he appointed 47 or 54 scholars. There's some debate about that. It doesn't matter. But these were the best scholars in the entire British Kingdom. King James put the entire resources of the British Kingdom behind this translation. and he picked the very best scholars in the world. These were men who spoke Hebrew and Greek, conversed in Hebrew and Greek, and read Hebrew and Greek. They were very well informed. Now, the translation was done in public. That is to say, as they translated, they made the information, the translation, publicly available. So anybody could scrutinize the work as it went along. And when these great scholars were uncertain of something, they would take it out to the churches. They would go to the pastors of the various churches, to the congregations, and they would pray about these things, and then they would go back to the drawing board and continue with the translation. So the whole process was in full scrutiny of anyone who wanted to see what was going on. Now, contrast this with Benjamin Blaney's revision. Benjamin Blaney's revision was not done with open scrutiny to the public or the academic community. He was one man in 1769 with a master's degree, no formal training in Hebrew or Greek. One man compared to the 47 or 54 of the best scholars in the British Kingdom that translated the 1611, Blaney was one man with no Greek or Hebrew training. So how is it that this one man, in private, in secret, makes a revision of the work of 47 of the best scholars who actually spoke the ancient languages, conversed in Hebrew and Greek, read it, understood it? How is it that one guy, Benjamin Blaney, was able to produce a Bible that was superior? It makes no sense. Furthermore, Blaney was an Episcopalian. Episcopalians were basically half Roman Catholic and half Protestant. And if push came to shove, they invariably fell to the Roman Catholic side of things. That was Benjamin Blaney. And indeed, after the KJV revision came off the press in 1769, Blaney then went back to school to learn Hebrew and Greek, and he spent a considerable amount of time earning a doctorate, after which he then did translations of Jeremiah and a couple of other Old Testament books using the Vatican manuscripts. He did not use the texts that the translators of the 1611 used to produce the authorized 1611 King James Bible. He used Vatican manuscripts. So this is the difference. This guy, Benjamin Blaney, was not favorably disposed to the underlying texts used by the translators of the authorized 1611 King James Bible. Let me return to the reason that I'm making this message. It's because of misguided comments from people who don't really know this subject, but want to challenge me in ways that are simply not credible, nor are they adequately informed historically, nor have they actually compared the 1611 to their KJV. They claim to, some of them, but if you have in fact done this yourself, you will know that most of these people have not. And so I wrote a book, authorized, The Real 1611 King James Bible. And in that book, I provide the historic background and I discuss many of the problems with the KJV. I'll read you a little bit from the introduction, which begins with tingling ears. Few have actually read the authentic 1611 authorized King James Bible. However, many think they have because they've read the King James Version, KJV. And fewer still have carefully compared the 1611 authorized King James Bible and the KJV. In this book, I will explain some of the critical differences between the two Bibles, both bearing the name of King James, but only one legitimately. Now I'm going to skip down to page 12. I'm still reading in the introduction, beginning in the second to last paragraph on that page. Impersonation and corruption of the pure word began almost immediately after the 1611 authorized King James Bible was published. and it has continued over the last 400 years, with impostor after impostor littering the Christian community, presuming to take the place of the 1611. Yet there is no Bible today that can legitimately claim to be a faithful update or equally represent the Bible that King James authorized and published in 1611. Moreover, acquiring a faithful and unaltered 1611 authorized King James Bible is difficult and sometimes confusing, as most publishers sell Bibles claiming to be the 1611, many of which are reprints of altered versions produced after the real authorized King James Bible came off the press in 1611. Such is the KJV, with its many changes. Scrivener commented on this. If you don't know who Scrivener is, do a little bit of research. He was a very well-respected Greek and Hebrew scholar, considered one of the very best in the 1800s. And he wrote this: "Numberless and not inconsiderable departures from the original or standard edition of the authorized translation published in 1611 are to be found in the modern Bibles, which issue from the press by the thousands every year. Some of these differences must be imputed to oversight and negligence, from which no work of man can be entirely free, but much the greater part of them are deliberate changes, introduced silently and without authority by men whose names are unknown." So here Scrivener is commenting on Bibles that come after the 1611, and that would include the KJV. Now we know that there was considerable outcry in the academic community regarding Bibles like the KJV, because in 1848, Reverend James W. McLean was employed by the American Bible Society to compare the leading British editions of the so-called 1611 King James Bible, that is, of the Bibles that purport to be the 1611. And he compared those fake Bibles with the original 1611. That is the first printing that came off the press in 1611. Now, his catalog showed few differences between the current leading versions, that is, the Bibles that were being published in the 1800s, and here's what he said: "As illustrating the necessity of the present collation and the remarks already made upon the exposure of variation and error in the printing of so many millions of copies, it may suffice here to mention that the number of variations recorded by the collator solely in the text and punctuation of the 6 copies compared, that includes the KJV, falls little short of 24,000. Now, I've footnoted all these references in my book, Authorized the Real 1611 King James Bible. So if that's something you think you need to verify, you can get my book, check the references. This is indeed what the scholars were saying in the 1800s. Let me continue quoting from my book. Commenting further, James Price, in his book titled King James Onlyism, a New Sect, wrote the following: "It must be observed, however, that a large percentage of the 24,000 variations were due to modernization of spelling, grammatical forms, and punctuation changes, changes that had little or no effect on meaning and truth. More important are those changes that did affect meaning in some way." So James Price is acknowledging that there were many changes, but he's also saying that some of them did affect meaning. Now, this was the general view when the KJV came out and for a while thereafter. Here's another important historic fact, and I'll continue reading from my book. Pollard notes in his biographical introduction to the 1611 that there were several editions printed by Barker, the printer of the first printing of the 1611. These subsequent editions, Pollard notes, were not faithful to the first printing. In fact, there were 2 editions printed in 1611, the first being the correct 1611, and the subsequent editions that came out of Barker's office of questionable accuracy. Here's what Pollard writes. After the first edition completed in 1611, an entirely new one was put in hand, the issue of the bulk of which belongs to 1613. And in this year there appeared also a folio reprint for church use in smaller type. A third edition in the largest type was published in 1617, a fourth in 1634, and a fifth in 1640. Now, this is important information because only the 1611 first printing is faithful. That's the one that the 47 best scholars in the kingdom approved. That's the one that King James approved. That's the 1611 that you want. All the subsequent editions have corruptions, and they lead up to Benjamin Blaney's revision. You can see the trend, the devil corrupting the real 1611 a little at a time until we get to the Episcopalian Benjamin Blaney, who again had no training in Hebrew or Greek, but revised the 1611. This was the trend, and this is how Satan works. Now we know that Pollard's testimony and statement is correct because Barker, the printer of the first edition of the 1611, the first printing, spent his last days in debtor's prison, unable to settle the many lawsuits filed against him for supplying imperfect books. Pollard notes that Barker's subsequent printings exhibit a combination of sheets from the first and second printings, where discrepancies in dates and other things appear. So this is important information because it's leading up to the KJV, which is not a translation. It is a revision. Now these people who have perhaps ignorantly commented about this subject and obviously know nothing of these matters and have not compared the 1611 and the KJV. They have no idea of the history of corrupting the 1611 that led to the KJV. Let me continue reading from my book. Also, textual corruption began creeping in, as documented by Reverend Walter E. Smith, who published an article in 1890 titled The Great She Bible, referring to the second edition of the 1611 and most certainly the KJV, wherein the pronoun in Ruth chapter 3 verse 15 is incorrectly rendered. The first and correct edition of the 1611 reads, He went into the city, and the latter, including the KJV, reads, She went into the city. It's important to note that all Reformation Bibles, 1611 included, said He went into the city, not she went into the city. The KJV says she went into the city. I've already explained why he went into the city is the correct rendering. And indeed, the 47 scholars, 54 if you seek a different source, but there was a lot of them, the reason they used he is because it's the correct rendering. And they took these issues out to the pastors and the congregations and other scholars, and it was settled that he went to the city. So when Blaney says she went to the city, he's ignorantly changing that pronoun. One man changing the pronoun compared to the 47 or 54 best scholars in the British Kingdom who consulted with the academic community at large and the churches. There can be very little doubt that this one man, Blaney, with no training in Hebrew and Greek, didn't know what he was doing. Let me continue reading from my book. Pollard references Dr. F.H.A. Scrivener's book titled The Authorized Edition of the English Bible, in brackets, 1611, noting that Scrivener maintained, quote, that the opportunity of a new edition would be used for making the text more correct. So far from this being the case, It is practically invariably my experience that for every error corrected in a 17th century reprint, at least 2 are introduced. In other words, Scrivener's scrutiny of the 1611, comparing it to subsequent editions, reveals that there are many errors in these so-called corrected versions. That includes the KJV of 1769, produced by the Episcopalian Benjamin Blaney. Now you're going to find many of the forewords or introductory notes in the KJV Bibles, the common KJV Bible that most people read today, many misleading statements. So let me read from my book once again. Most printings of what is mistakenly called the KJV, implying the 1611 Authorized King James Bible, fail to inform readers of certain facts. Moreover, introductory notes are often misleading, and some make patently false statements, certain that most readers will not take the time to verify claims. One example is the 1976 Thomas Nelson edition named Authorized King James Version. Authorized by whom? Certainly not King James, wherein the preface notes titled Special Features of Your Giant Print Reference Bible state the following. Now I'm quoting directly from the Thomas Nelson edition, 1976, purporting to be the Authorized King James Version. And this is what the publishers said. Quote, "This Bible contains the text of the King James Version, originally published in 1611. Unquote. The statement is entirely false, as the text is representative of many changes noted by the collator Reverend James W. McLean in 1848. It cannot be said to represent the text originally published in 1611 by King James and the translators. Thomas Nelson Publishers is misleading the reader. Neither is that particular Blaney version authorized by King James or the translators. It is a revision, and if the translators and King James saw that, they would recoil in disgust and disappointment, and there is no way it would be authorized by King James or the Translation Committee. Not possible. Let me give you another example of the deception in these printings of the KJV. Quoting again from my book, Authorized, the Real 1611 King James Bible. Another example is the preface to Hendrickson Publishers' 11th printing of the King James Version 1873 edition. The preface was written by John Kohlenberger III. It states that Dr. Benjamin Blaney's edition was published in 1769 by Oxford. Although it is true that it was published in 1769, Blaney did not have a doctorate at that time, yet Kohlenberger leads the reader to believe he did. When Kohlenberger refers to Blaney as doctor, he creates a false impression that Blaney was eminently qualified to make revisions. At the time of Blaney's revision in 1769, Blaney held a master's degree from Oxford with no training in ancient Hebrew or Greek. Those are facts of history. You can verify them yourself. They are not secrets. Continuing with my reading, there are many deceptions surrounding the KJV and its sister Bibles that I could cite. However, for the time being, this evidence should be sufficient to suggest that the text of the 1611 Authorized King James Bible was indeed altered significantly in the KJV, and that scholars and publishers are not above spinning the facts in their introductions to create an impression of credibility and honest intentions. Now I'll give you one more scriptural example of where Benjamin Blaney's 1769 KJV corrupts the Word of God. This happens in the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 7. The real 1611 Authorized King James Bible uses the final phrase in chapter 2, verse 7, nor awake my love till she please. She, the pronoun she. All the Reformation Bibles agree the pronoun is she. Yet Blaney's revision changes that pronoun to he. They both can't be the Word of God. They're two very different testimonies. Okay, so the KJV, Blaney's edition, says, awake my love till he please. The reason the 47 best scholars in the world went with she please is because it makes sense contextually. Otherwise, King Solomon is holding a man in his arms, and this sends out the wrong message entirely. What is Solomon doing, holding this man in his arms and calling this man my love? It opens the door to all kinds of erroneous speculation. So Benjamin Blaney, one guy, no training in ancient Hebrew, changes the pronoun from she to he. The 47 scholars, the best in the British Kingdom, and all the other Reformation Bibles have the correct reading. And so the KJV, although it's better than the modern translations, it contains corruptions. And there are some distinct reasons, which I have presented. And this evidence was supported and observed by very important and very well-known scholars of the day. Yet those scholars have been swept under the carpet, and KJV defenders believe the introductory notes from their publishers and from guys like Kohlenberger III, who gets his paycheck, by the way, from Rupert Murdoch, a papal knight. That's a whole other subject. Anyway, I wanted to put some of this information on the table. There is a lot more that I could say about this, and there are many, many more examples of where the KJV corrupts the original text, and indeed introduces different doctrines and conflicts directly with the 1611. So if anybody says to you they've compared the real 1611 to the KJV and there's no difference, you can count on the fact that they have not studied this thoroughly. They have not studied it historically, nor have they actually carefully gone through and made the comparisons, nor have they understood these changes and why Blaney introduced them. I'll leave it at that for now. But folks, study to show yourselves approved. Don't be like these guys who think they know something and are unwilling to actually do the hard work. Bless you all, and thank you for listening.